Welcome, everyone. It is especially wonderful to be with you all here today on a very drizzly St. Patrick's Day at the start of the 14th Asia Week festivities here in New York. It is such a gratifying relief to be back to hosting events in person with lovers of Japanese art traveling again to New York this March. However, one of the great silver linings of the past 2 years of forced isolation has been the development of online programming. I and my extremely talented team remain committed to this process as it enables us to reach a vastly wider audience from across the country and around the globe. In addition, the recording of the event remains available on the internet for long thereafter. It also enables us to bring together artists and experts from different locations to join us for a moment in time to both educate and captivate our audience. As unfortunately COVID restrictions in Japan remain rather severe, we are so disappointed, as I'm sure you would be, to know that Kondō Takahiro, whose show we are presenting now, is physically unable to be present in New York. But he is with us live from Kyoto, and his comments will be interpreted by the very talented cultural translator Yoshikawa Tomo. During these remarkably different, truly difficult times, I also want to just pause to note the brave Ukrainians fighting for their country's survival, and for those in Northeast Japan who are once again recovering from the damage perpetrated by yet another wrath of nature, Mother Nature falling down upon them. We applaud and support all your efforts to bring your countries in good order. However, happily tonight, we are here to celebrate the pioneering and brilliant Japanese ceramic artist, Kondō Takahiro, and his extraordinary oeuvre. It is over 20 years since Kondo-san and I first met. I was introduced to him by Gallery Nakamura, who was a cousin of my dear friend Kusaka Chieko, in 1998, when my husband Bob and I were living in Japan for a period of some years. It was at a very small gallery in Shibuya, Tokyo, and I was immediately smitten by his work. And the works that you see on the screen, particularly the one on the right, was typical of the work that was available in that exhibition. For me, Kondo-san is exactly what I look for when I'm looking for a living clay artist. And in many ways, he reminds me of the subject of my preceding panel, Kamoda Shoji. He is in his case, principally a porcelain artist who also works in stoneware, who also works in an array of media. He does wood firing, electric firing, gas firing. He mixes materials. His work is both functional and sculptural nature. It is equally irresistible and exquisite and technically perfect, but he does not repeat himself. Kondo-san comes from a distinguished lineage, and his fascinating historical background will be divulged to you by Joe Earle shortly. Kondo-san is extremely thoughtful, generally concerned about the field, supportive of other artists, and the status of clay art, both nationally and internationally. When I met Kondo-san in the late 90s and moved back to New York, I was asked by Barry Friedman, a leading dealer in international art and design, to organize an exhibition for him in 2001. At that time, I did not have a gallery. I was dealing privately. And we came to put together a show called Masters of Clay, 5 Artists from Kyoto. That 2001 exhibition focused on the work of Suzuki Osamu, Morino Taime, Miyashita Zenji, Kishi Eiko, and of course, Kondō Takahiro. This was Kondo-san's New York debut, and it led to 4 further exhibitions in New York at Barry's gallery, and then from then on with me in my current location on Madison Avenue. In the course of the past 20+ years, my gallery has placed nearly 300 of his works in US and international collections. part of the fun part of knowing Kondo-san is his generosity of spirit and knowing him on a personal basis. And here you see Carol and Kondo at an exhibition, the Kahitsukan, in 2017. On almost every tour where I've brought avid collectors to Japan, Kondo and his incredible wife Hitomi have opened their doors to us and made visits to them the highlight of my travels. Here you can see us up in Sendai, not far from where the devastating tsunami hit, where we have a group of incredibly avid collectors, and you can see the kind of preparation that he and Hitomi and his team go to make us warm and comfortable and make for incredibly memorable meals and events. More recently, in placing one of his reduction works at the Musée Guémet, we were able to travel together to Paris and see his work installed in their Rotunda gallery, where I believe it's on permanent view. You can see the poster for his work at the top, which was for a show on contemporary Asian art and Buddhist art. And there he is, his pride of place. He's also on the outside of the building. So this amazing friendship and collegial friendship, I should say, led to the publication or the making of my book called The Allure of Japanese Contemporary Ceramics. Kondo felt very strongly that a book needed to be written that explained to the Japanese what it was about contemporary clay art, particularly Japanese, in America, that the Japanese themselves did not quite understand. So he was incredibly helpful in connecting me with Mitsuhiro Suiko Shoin, who is a publisher of another book that you're about to hear about. And we put this book together, part of which was this amazing conversation that we had between 2018 and 2019 that started off in Toronto, Canada, where he had a residency at the Gardner Ceramic Museum in Toronto, the Gardner Museum, and proceeded to Tokyo, back to Kyoto, where we expounded on the ideas that we batted back and forth. I want to just read a quote that what he wrote in this book that I think really isolates his philosophy. Quote, "From here on, as clay art continues to evolve, the point at which ceramics either holds its own with contemporary art or crosses over and becomes contemporary art will be determined not just by the level of skill or expressiveness of the artist, but by each and every artist's individual sense of aesthetics and ideology. In my case, there are many areas of creativity yet to be explored and much work still unfinished. Moving forward, my intention is to focus on the power inherent in clay art." So at long last, we are able to present the show that's up now, which is called Making Waves. And we, after an amazing confluence of circumstances, the incredibly talented Chinese modern painter Bing Yi was in my gallery last autumn, at the time where 5 works, advanced works, came to the gallery to be photographed for PR purposes last September. Bing Yi actually was moved to tears when she saw Takahiro's work and was genuinely moved and inspired by his works. So with a lot of deliberation and conversation with the Ink Studio, his representatives, we coordinated to make 2 conjoint shows in my gallery where her work was totally inspired by his work. Every painting in the show was created to reflect upon his work as a clay artist and her work as an ink painter. So those of you who are not in New York, we will be putting pictures up on our website. But if you are in the area, we're keeping the show up through April 22nd, and I strongly encourage you to come and take a look. Tonight, for our 21st Zoom panel, we have assembled an illustrious group of clay fans to bring to life this man, his work, and the exhibition itself. We, in fact, had over 300 people register for this event from as far away as Australia, but includes many European countries, the United Arab Emirates, many from the UK, Romania, remarkably Russia, and guests from over 25 states across the country. The audience is comprised of many curators and museum professionals from over 20 museums, plus numerous curators, dealers, art appraisers, art history professors, and a remarkable number of clay artists. And a shout out to Jennifer Lee, who's joining us from Britain, and Futomori Yoshimi from Paris, France. For panelists, I'm thrilled to be able to welcome two renowned scholars and experts, Glenn Adamson and Joe Earle, and maybe most significantly, the important collector and patron, Carol Horvitz. I will introduce each of them just prior to their comments. But before doing so, I have to thank two people. One is the steadfast, ever-patient Ruta Noreka, now residing in Scotland. She's a lifelong friend and advisor to Kondo-san, and she has proved to be dependently unruffled, focused, and endlessly supportive throughout this process. Also, heartfelt thanks to Bonnie Lee, our gallery manager, who runs these programs so efficiently and seamlessly as she rehearses and works with our speakers, handles countless details, registration, and creates the PowerPoint that you are enjoying tonight. So let's start with my first question to my esteemed colleague and Joe Earle. Joe is the senior consultant of Japanese art at Bonhams and has worked for nearly a half-century in the field of Japanese art. He has held leadership positions at the Victorian Albert in London, the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston, and Japan Society in New York. Along the way, he has organized more than 24 exhibitions of Japanese art and has written and translated or edited publications on various aspects of Japanese culture, ranging from contemporary art and design through samurai sword fittings to flower arrangement bronzes. Now based in London, he advises collectors, dealers, and institutions on 3 continents. So Joe, our Superman, can I ask you, firstly, for the audience tonight, Kondō Takahiro and his artworks, such as his striking sculptural forms and patented gintekisai silver mist overglaze that we see in this latest exhibition, are already quite known throughout the world. But many may not know the path that this signature style and how it came to be in creating such an innovative and original technique. How can we understand Kondo in the Japanese ceramic context, particularly as someone who came out of an esteemed ceramic lineage, yet treads a completely unique path? Can you give us a brief tour through the stylistic and aesthetic development of Kondō Takahiro's oeuvre? Joe?
Yes, thank you very much, Joan. I've crafted a response to that question, and it's called the Kondo lineage challenging tradition, with the idea that, yes, he does come from a lineage, but that lineage itself has always sought to open up new horizons and break with convention. He was born in 1958 into a lineage based in Kyoto, which, as most of you will know, is the epicenter of Japan's elite cultures and has been for more than 1,200 years. But despite that long history, in fact, the involvement of the Kondo family with ceramic art didn't begin until 1914, when grandfather Kondo Yuzo enrolled at the age of 12 in the city's Ceramic Development Center, and in 1921 became assistant to Tomimoto Kenkichi, a familiar name, who was the most influential ceramic innovator of his era. Shown in my first slide are 3 white glazed wheel-thrown porcelain jars by Tomimoto and 2 Kondos, Takahiro in the center, each demonstrating the centrality of porcelain, vessel form, and hand-throwing skills as inculcated by Tomimoto throughout the family tradition. My second slide shows a group of porcelain vases with freely painted underglazed cobalt blue decoration that, just like the undecorated vases, again owe much to the example of Tomimoto, whose own output also included many vessels with spontaneous-looking landscape scenes and other motifs that reflect his oft-quoted, perhaps even over-quoted dictum, do not make patterns from patterns. In seeking to understand the development of Kondō Takahiro's art, and especially the ginteki silver mist finish that we're going to hear a lot about, it's important to remember too how metallic glazes played an important role early in the Kondō tradition. Their mentor Tomimoto is perhaps best known today, as you see in this slide, for intricate textile-like designs that include gold and silver, as well as a range of enamel colors. These helped him earn the title of Living National Treasure in 1955. Kondō Takahiro's father and grandfather, in the next slide, also frequently applied a layer of gold glaze before the final firing. Now, Takahiro started off unexpectedly, perhaps, as a championship-level table tennis player, but was eventually inspired to embark on a career in clay by the early death in 1983 of his uncle Yutaka, also an outstanding ceramic artist. By that time, Yuzo's masterly porcelain vessels had earned him the accolade of Living National Treasure in 1977. And he passed on his style to his second son, Hiroshi, who in turn made young Takahiro his own apprentice. In 1990, the family sent the young man all the way over to Sao Paulo, where he had a solo show dedicated to work in his version of the house style. But Takahiro's conversations with painters and sculptors in Brazil alerted him to the limitations of a practice confined just to scenes from nature, applied in blue pigment to the surfaces of perfectly thrown porcelain vessels. On his return to Japan, he embarked on a series of experiments, and mostly abandoned wheel-thrown vessel forms in favor of rectilinear shapes created by hand building, making flat surfaces better suited, to abstract patterning. The revolutionary example of Uncle Yutaka also played a part, along with the metallic glazes we've already seen, in the creation of ginteki as a radical alternative surface finish. Yutaka became particularly interested in a type of Korean ware called bunchong, it's called mishima in Japanese, that's created by incising or stamping an intricate repeated design, as you see on the piece in the right background here, then covering it with semi-liquid white clay that's wiped off the raised sections of the surface, filling only the depressions. So from about 1999, Takahiro devoted his energies to developing this ginteki or gintekisai, the silver mist, as his signature surface finish, building on two elements of the family tradition, metallic glazes and surface patterning. I've chosen this much a later example to start with. It's actually on steel, but I love the image, which is from the new book we're going to talk about in a moment. Ginteki was first trialed in 1994 and further improved by the artist until 2004, when it received an official patent of the Japanese government. In its essence, ginteki is made from silver, the principal ingredient, and frit, a mixture of silica and fluxes, to which he later added gold, platinum, and other materials, mixed together to form a paint that's brushed on the surface of a ceramic vessel. During kiln firing, here's another example from the upcoming exhibition, the droplets of paint solidify, in the artist's own words, taking on an appearance that looks almost more like water than real water, or water born of fire. As Takahiro has recently commented, this technique has now taken over from blue and white decoration as the defining characteristic of my contemporary work. It's also largely thanks to silver mist that starting in the year 2000, I could extend my practice to include pieces that were more sculptural in character. In 2002 to 3, Takahiro, a great friend of Scotland, made the longest of a series of visits there, enrolling at Edinburgh College of Art and adding cast glass to his practice, something there's no time to go into right now, I'm afraid. On a trip to the Orkney Islands off Scotland's northern coast, he saw the Ring of Brodgar, an ancient stone circle made, in his words, of huge rocks connecting heaven and earth, life and death, past and future. Just as important, journeying south of the border to London, he was able to experience the international art scene in the same year that British artist Grayson Perry was awarded the prestigious Turner Prize. The shock of learning that an artist whose practice included pots could enjoy such a high level of global name recognition prompted Takahiro to think about his future direction, leading in particular to the monoliths that we see here actually installed in Orkney, structures that push the boundaries between conventional Japanese ceramics and the potential of clay as a medium for contemporary art. And there are examples in the current exhibition at the Joan Mirviss Gallery. Now, before I conclude with the most recent stage of Takahiro's practice, I'd like to spend a moment looking at some projects and events that really can't be fully experienced outside of Japan. Following the Tohoku earthquake on our minds today, because there's just been another earthquake in the same part of Japan, and the tsunami and Fukushima nuclear disaster of March 2011, Takahiro worked with members of a workshop in the same region, seen here, digging local clay and making small ceramic bowls for the displaced victims. Working on a pottery wheel for the first time in many years, he's really abandoned the wheel for a long time, he made nearly 2,000 of these inochi no utsuwa, vessels of life. A more technically elaborate response to the disaster was the Hotaru Firefly series, little cubes of ordinary glass, each enclosing a small piece of uranium glass and containing a tiny percentage of the radioactive material that, under ultraviolet light, emitted a greenish glow, drawing attention to radiation's lasting effect on the human race. A small installation was shown at the Pier Art Center, Stromness, Orkney, in September 2011, just 6 months after the disaster. But here's another iteration seen in combination with two of the reduction pieces that we'll hear about later. Another less known aspect of Takahiro's practice, almost entirely confined to Japan, except one that he did in Maui, in Hawaii, is illustrated by this moment from one of his noyaki, outdoor firings, events that he's been involved with since 1996. In these, holes are dug in the ground, filled with dry clay artifacts, in this case, one of his reduction pieces formed from raku clay, and fired using fallen leaves and forest thinnings instead of normal materials as fuel. These firings are essentially performative events, typically accompanied by much dancing, drumming, and Shinto religious ritual. And the resulting works are only rarely put on public view. But in conclusion, Takahiro has recently been exploring anew the significance of vessel form and the nature of ceramic art. In the same way that the Fukushima disaster had reminded the world of the fallibility of technology when confronted by overwhelming natural forces, he's come to realize afresh that ceramic art is an endeavor requiring not just the exercise of the potter's skill, but also a respect for spontaneous natural factors beyond human comprehension and indeed beyond human control. Over the last 8 years, he's completed close to 100 hakuji otsubo, big white porcelain jars, it means, sometimes starting with upwards of 150 pounds of porcelain clay. These latest creations are large, dynamic, and generously formed, and at times they split open, so they're no longer literal containers, but abstract forms that interrogate the relationship between a vessel and its inner space. They cannot but make me, and I hope the rest of you joining us today, optimistic about the capacity of the Kondō family and its tradition to transcend boundaries and keep on surprising us all. Now, I'd like to say just a very few words about a book that's coming out, published on the 30th of this month. It's published by Mitsumura Suikoin, who also published the book that Joan mentioned a few moments ago. This is a 368-page book devoted to every aspect of his work, incredibly beautiful photography, rare examples from throughout his career, including better known works, and also things that you can't experience too much outside of Japan, especially, for example, the noyaki firings, which are shown in great detail. And it also has texts, illuminating texts by both Japanese and American contributors. We have one by Kondo himself outlining his career. We have one by Kyoto intellectual Inaga Shigemi, entitled The Vessel Transcends Itself, Transcending the Vessel, all about the relationship in Kondo's work between these three factors, if you like, vessel, body, and void. And we also have essays by 4 distinguished American curators whose museums have examples of his reduction pieces. We have another by Sophie Macariou from Paris. And finally, last but not least, we have an essay by Kajiwara the director of the Kaitsukan, and last but not least, essays by two dealers, Adrian Sassoon in London, and of course, Joan Mirviss in New York. I hope you'll look out for that book, and the gallery can provide you with details of how to get hold of it. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Joe. I can't believe you got all that in 10 minutes, 30 years of an incredibly varied and technically challenging career. For all of you who are not familiar with Kondo Takahiro's work, you just had a Zoom course. And of course, there's more to come. And this book, I actually have the first dummy copy of the book. It's magnificent. And we look forward to its arrival on the North American continent, hopefully within the month. It's magnificent. Thank you for all your hard work putting this amazing tome together, Joe. My next question is going to be for Glenn. Glenn Adamson is currently a curator, writer, and historian based in New York. He has previously been the director of the Museum of Art and Design, head of research at the Victoria and Albert Museum, curator at the Chipstone Foundation in Milwaukee. Glenn's publications include Thinking Through Craft from 2007, The Craft Reader from 2010, Postmodernism, Style and Subversion from 2011 that accompanied an exhibition of the same title at the V&A. The Invention of Craft from 2013, Art in the Making from 2016, and Fewer Better Things, The Hidden Wisdom of Objects from 2018, and Objects, USA 2020. His most recent book, Craft in American History, was published by Bloomsbury just this past year in 2021. So Glenn, my question to you is, drawing on the themes of water and its many aspects found in nature, Kondo-san's signature original creation of gintekisai, or silver mist overglaze, has been the most recognizable feature of his artwork for several decades. How do you think we can understand this distinctive overglaze application from a design and contemporary art perspective? Glenn?
Thank you so much, Joan. It's a real honor to be with you all tonight, and of course with the artist himself. I'm just going to touch quite briefly on that topic, which is admittedly a complex one. And I thought it might be interesting to look at two perhaps unexpected works in relation to the ginteki glaze that Kondo has made his signature. I might first observe that it is striking that an artist like Kondo would have a signature, because that's not necessarily something that we associate with pottery. The idea of a signature style is something that perhaps we might indeed expect to find more often in a fine art context, a painting and sculpture context. But I'd also like to place emphasis on something that Joe quoted and you just alluded to as well, which is Kondo's remark that the ginteki glaze is more like water than water itself, which implies that the surface has a kind of virtual character, a hyper-real character, which makes you think immediately of the question of the object as it is mediated, rather than the object as it's experienced in real life in 3 dimensions in front of you. And of course, the great figure for thinking through that question in the 20th century was Andy Warhol. And it's no coincidence that probably of all the art historical precedents for the ginteki glaze, the one that comes closest is in fact a series by Warhol, not one of his better known ones. It's the diamond dust paintings that he made in the very early 1980s. These tellingly come from a period of Warhol's career where he's widely considered to have sort of sold out. It's a time when he's really committed himself to doing society portraiture and other rather self-regarding projects. This is also the year in which, for example, he made a series of big paintings of dollar signs as if to print his own currency. And the Diamond Dust series should be seen as part of that rather ironic context. Now, in retrospect, this has actually come to be seen as one of the most interesting periods of his work, because his engagement with the question of the market and the situatedness of fine art in the overall commodity sphere has come to be one of the topics that he's seen to be most beguilingly prescient about. So in that connection the use of diamond dust, which, by the way, was achieved with ground glass rather than actual dust of actual diamonds, although he did experiment with that. But this idea of putting a shining surface on the painting that refers to the media imagery, like the imagery of the shoes here, which makes you think about an advertising photograph as appearing in a magazine, perhaps. It very clearly refers to a kind of externalization or a meditation on the very production of the image and the circulation of the image in culture. And if you'll just go to the next slide, we can see that line of thought has been carried forward very forcibly in the contemporary art space, maybe most famously by Damien Hirst in this wonderful, maddening, infuriating work called For the Love of God. Of the many hilarious things there are to say about this piece, one of my favorite is that the title was partly inspired by Hirst's own mother, who apparently said to him, "For the love of God, what have you done next?" and this was sort of the answer. It's also, of course, that title is also, of course, an extremely ironic and satirical allusion to the idea that this would be a self-portrait. So the artist as a godlike figure. Hirst was inspired to make it partly by these turquoise paved skulls that exist from the ancient Mesoamerican context. But at any rate, you can see that by using actual diamonds instead of fake diamond dust, Hirst has literally raised the stakes on Warhol's gambit to think about the relationship between an artwork and its own commodity status. And there's been a lot written, including quite recently, about the actual financial structure of this artwork, which supposedly, when it was first made, was sold by Hirst's gallery, White Cube, J. Joplin's gallery in London, for $50 million. It later turned out that that was probably not quite true, and in fact, that Hirst and J. Joplin retained ownership of a kind of majority stake in the object, so that it was more like an initial public offering of a stock than like a conventional sale of an artwork. But you can certainly see that, again, this formal character of the shining surface of the object refers to a whole set of questions about the way that an object might be said to perform in the media landscape and by extension in the art market. So it's in that context, I think, that we should see Kondō Takahiro's Ginteki glaze, a very unexpected context, because what it implies is that he's engaging with the whole question of how a ceramic can function in the 21st century, that is to say, in a very populated image landscape, in a context in which ceramic is not just received as a functional object, but received as an object that meditates upon its own status as aesthetic at all. And so another point that Joe, remark that Joe quoted to us, which I think is very, very important, is that the Ginteki glaze allowed Kondō to create conceptual sculpture, which when you first hear it sounds quite strange. How would a particular glaze, which is essentially technical and decorative, pave the way for a conceptual departure in the work? But I think that's exactly what it has done. And in my later remarks about his figural sculpture, I'll return to that theme, but I think I'll leave it there for now.
Thank you, Glenn. You've definitely opened the door to further, shall I say, reflection on the surface and the attention to reflective surface on a global stage that I look forward to hearing more from shortly. Okay, so my next question is to the man himself, the man of the hour, Kondo Takahiro, who is with us at 6:30 in the morning. And I certainly wouldn't want to be doing one of these Zoom panels at 6:30 in the morning. So I'm very grateful. He's with us and awake and alert. So dear friend Kondo-san, my question to you, which will be interpreted by Yoshizawa-san, as a life-giving force, water is an element with powerful and arguably spiritual associations. The reduction series of sculptures of your own body seated in a meditative pose further draws out this fascinating connection. Can you tell us more about your reduction series and any spiritual themes that you may have considered for their creation? How did this series expand and challenge your understanding as an artist, your thoughts on the theme of water. Kondo-san?
Hi. Nice to see you. 近藤隆弘です。皆さん。
Hi
本日
everyone.
は、このような、パネルのディスカッションの方に、多くの方々が参加していただきまして、誠にありがとうございます。
Thank you everyone for joining us today or tonight. So happy to see you all.
で、また今回コロナでちょっと展覧会にニューヨークまで行けなかったのは大変残念ですが、本当にいい展覧会になって喜んでいます。ありがとうございます。
I have so much like to be there physically to meet everyone there, but this pandemic situation didn't allow me, but I'm still happy that we could gather here tonight.
じゃあこれから今のジョンさんの質問にお答えしたいと思います。染付の最も代表的な、文様は、清流ですね。東アジアでは清流は水の神様です。私は染付もある意味水の象徴とこれまで考えてきました。そしてその染付に代わる水の表現として作り出したのがgintekisaiのオリジナル技法です。
So let me answer the question. The design most often associated with sommetsuke, cobalt blue underglaze, is the blue dragon. In Eastern Asia, the blue dragon is considered as the god of water. And I also came to believe that sommetsuke is another representation of water. And I wanted to find and create my own version, my own way of representing water instead of using sommetsuke. Silver mist overglaze is my original technique, which is the fruit of my quest for the new expression.
2000年、新しいミレニアムに入ってから、私のgintekisaiの作品が海外で展示されるようになります。その時、私は21世紀は水の世紀であると位置づけました。事実、現在の地球環境の問題、エネルギーの問題、そして生命にとって今後も水が大きな重要なキーワードだと感じています。近年、水には記憶する能力があるなど、水の研究が進んできていますが、気体、液体、固体と変化する水については、まだまだよくわからない謎な部分が多くあるのです。
From 2000, after we entered the new millennium, my silver series started to be exhibited abroad. And at that time, I thought that the water would be the most important resource in the coming century, that the 21st century is that the age of water. It is a fact that water is and will continue to play a crucial role in the global environmental problems and resource issues that we are faced today. And it's simply a truth that our lives do depend on water. There has been many interesting research made on water recently, and some say that water even retains memory. Clearly, there are many unknown aspects about this enigmatic substance that can transform its state from gas to liquid and to solid.
2011年 3.11 の東日本大震災の地震と津波、そして制御できなくなってしまった福島の原発の事故は、私にとっても大きな衝撃でした。
The Great East Japan earthquake and tsunami of March 11, 2011, and the following nuclear disaster in Fukushima nuclear plant left me in great shock.
そしてこの津波からインスパイアされて生まれたのが練り込みの茶碗でした。それが現在のウェーブの作品につながっています。
So this small nerikomi tea bowls with silver mist were my initial reaction to this tsunami disaster. And the wave work that I'm now is directly connected to that initial first work using nerikomi.
また私は2012年から2017年まで21体の瞑想を使用する座像、リダクションを制作してきました。
And the even more significant reaction to that disaster disaster is my reduction series. I made these 21 meditative figures between 2012 and 2017.
津波や地震で亡くなった方への鎮魂、そして時代を映す写せみとして制作し、国内外で展示してきた作品のシリーズです。
They are my memorial for all those who lost their lives as a result of a tsunami and earthquake. And the reduction series has come to be exhibited both in and out of Japan as a reflection of the changing times we live in and the temporal nature of things, just as the cicada sheds its shell and leaves a husk behind.
46億年前、火の玉の惑星であった地球は46億年かけて美しい水の惑星となりました。リダクションは21世紀が水の世紀という時代を内包した作品であり、水の地球、惑星がこれからも永遠に美しくあってほしいという願いでもあるのです。
So our planet Earth was just a blazing fireball 4.6 billion years ago. And it took all those years and now has become a beautiful planet of water. The reduction series contains and reflects my belief that this is the century of water, and it expresses my hopes and wishes for this beautiful planet of water to remain beautiful for its eternity. Thank you.
ありがとうございます。
Thank you, Takahiro-san. One of my great regrets in this 2-year period of isolation was my inability to travel to Japan to see your reduction piece in this amazing piece of architecture of the 6-sided building, and as it overlooks the area where all this devastation took place. I can think of no better installation for a reduction figure than this location, and I hope maybe at some point it gets redone and we get to visit it in person. Thank you for your insights. It's certainly illuminating to hear from the artist himself. I'm sure we'll all agree of what his sources of inspiration and his point of view is. Next speaker is a dear friend, and Carol Horvitz is a native of Cincinnati, and she had an early career establishing hospital cancer programs. After graduating from Tufts University, she received her JD and MPH from Boston University. Her passion for Asian art led her in 2008 to begin assembling a vast survey of Japanese contemporary ceramics, truly the largest outside of Japan, which is used by her as an outgoing program of gifting, loans, and exhibitions that involve some 30 museums throughout the United States. 2 important traveling shows are currently in the process, and we'll hear more about that. So Carol, who shares a broad interest in art with her husband, Jeffrey, is also a very well-known prominent collector. They happily live on a seashore, not so different from the picture on the screen, on the north shore of Boston Harbor. So Carol, my first question to you is, I truly have been a witness to your passion for clay, Japanese clay, and seen and witnessed how it's grown over the years. It's quite extraordinary. But Kondō Takahiro is really special to you, and I have seen his deep, deep connection between you and his works. Can you tell us how and why you fell in love with his work? Carol?
Thank you. Thank you. And thank you to our speakers so far. It's truly humbling to be on this panel. Thank you for including me. I hope I can deliver something, as interesting and fascinating. Thank you. So you're asking me how and why I fell in love with Kondo's works. So I'll start with, that's really a 2-part question. I'll start with the why. So, and a simple answer would be, once I saw his work, how could I not love it? But I'll go further than that. So even people who have never noticed or paid much attention to ceramic art react very strongly and positively to Kondo's ceramic works. In them, there is a beauty and a mystery that is self-evident. The photo on the right in this slide was taken at the Los Angeles County Museum of Art in 2008. That was the year that Jeffrey and I started collecting Japanese contemporary ceramics. I'm there next to a stunning green porcelain vase with glass cover from Kondo's Green Mist series. You can see in the close-up his signature metallic glaze streaming down the sides, accentuating the taper of the form. The image on the left was taken at the Peabody Essex Museum in Salem, Massachusetts, where this piece went after Los Angeles. It was so popular at the PEM that it remained there on continuous display until a few months ago when I retrieved it for something, a little something that's in the works that I think we've been hinting at. We'll talk about more later. So slide number 2, please. Here on slide number 2 is a recent piece from 2021, a large cobalt blue bowl with swirling metallic glaze from Kondo's Silver Mist series. In this piece, the mist and waves of clay draws you into a vortex at the bottom, a little universe with tiny galaxies in motion. Unfortunately, the photos can't do justice to the beauty and the mystery that you find in these works of art. They are captivating. With them, Kondō, the master of ceramic art, performs visual magic. So that's the why. Now, it's the second part of your question, the how. So slide 3, please. The simple answer, it's all her fault, which is very true. So Joan Mirviss was our introduction to Kondō-san and his art. Seen here, she's standing next to Kondo's marbleized monolith from 2016, which he titled Seismic Wave. Although explanations help you appreciate it, you can appreciate it just by looking. The glass centers the piece. You can see in the close-up of the glass on the right, suspended air bubbles and a mysterious floating dark pigment, which looks like splashed ink. Kondō layered the clay sections using a technique known as nerikomi, and pardon me if I pronounced it incorrectly, creating a marbling effect, which emerges from the clay in wave patterns of black, gray, and white. With the shimmery metallic glaze flowing down the surface of the clay, this piece absolutely takes my breath away. But Joan is not the only person to blame. Jeffrey, my husband, must be also held responsible. Upon seeing Kondō's work for the first time, Jeffrey too immediately recognized the genius of Kondō. A collector and connoisseur in several fields, impressed and intrigued by contemporary Japanese ceramic art, Jeffrey managed to absorb an astonishing amount of information very quickly, enabling us to purchase nearly 1,500 pieces in 14 years. Jeffrey's experience as a dealer in modern art in the 1970s and a museum trustee actually helped. So slide number 4. So here you see 3 large monoliths. Unbeknownst to me, in 2008, Jeffrey purchased 2 of the 3. He secretly stored both of those monoliths in our house for several years, gifted me the white one for our 20th anniversary and the green one for my 50th yesterday. Or actually, it hasn't happened. I could not imagine better presents. We recently commissioned the blue monolith for that little something I mentioned earlier. So slide 5, please. Since our introduction in 2008, we have acquired 41 works by Kondo Takahiro. Some were gifts to museums, and most have or will be loaned and exhibited. In this slide, I am seated in one of our 3 home gallery rooms. To my left is a smaller monolith that was gifted to the Peabody Essex Museum. And I apologize, I think it's washed out in this photo. Jeffrey took the photo. On the right, you see a small red box, which brings me back to a very special memory. When I saw this piece while visiting Kondō-san's home, I guess he saw me looking at it. I couldn't take my eyes off it. And he secretly offered it to Jeffrey for me. Kondō-san's work is so important to me that after a visit to the Kondō Family Museum in 2017, I told him of my hope to develop a traveling exhibition of works from his family. That hope has become a reality for next year. Again, we'll talk about that later. So slide 6. But the real explanation as to both the how and the why comes from Kondō himself, how he speaks through his art. Here he is on the left at his home with one of his reduction pieces. On the right, he's with an installation of his blue monoliths at the Orkney Islands that Joe had in his slides earlier. The monoliths in the background that inspired him. Intrigued when I learned of this, we traveled to this site. We experienced the barren landscape with the strange spiritual aura. Kondo-san's work resonates with the ancient. Finally, my simple answer is the how and the why is we saw, we loved, we acquired. So we are now pleased to share it with all of you. Thank you.
Thank you, Carol. We get the picture, but we haven't seen the full picture, the extent of Jeffrey and Carol's collection. And as Jeffrey often has stated, she has yet to meet a work by Kondo that she didn't want to acquire. And I think that's true. I think she loves absolutely every single work that she's ever laid her eyes upon, and has nevertheless cherry-picked the best of the best for their collection. I would like to return back to Joe, I should say, for my next question. Joe, marbleized clay is a fairly recent addition to Kondo's artist toolkit, but the technique has been around for quite a long time. Could you give us a brief introduction to this mesmerizing technique and how it appears in other cultures, as well as in Japan's own ceramic tradition? Joe?
Absolutely, thank you. Well, it goes back a long time. During the 1st century AD, some of the earliest marbleized terracotta wares were being made at an important Roman center of ceramic production in southern France, as you see here. And leaping on nearly 2,000 years, the technique was also popular in 18th century English factories, next slide please, under the name agate ware, with the intention of creating a surface emulating the polished surface of the semi-precious stone, agate. In East Asia, marbling makes its first appearance in China during the Tang Dynasty, 7th, 8th century, when jiaotai, twisted body wares, were created by carefully hand-forming the body out of 2 clays, as in this small, intricate example from the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston. But marbling actually came quite late to Japan itself. It makes few appearances before the 20th century, and it only really garnered wide critical and popular esteem quite late in the post-war era. This is largely thanks to the work of studio ceramist Matsui Kosei, but also at a different but still influential and important level, designer potter Ida Yusuke. Ida promoted nerikomi wares nationwide in a 1979 TV commercial, part of a long series about men who know what makes a difference. All men, by the way. And he was pictured executing the technique here, as you see here, before enjoying Nescafe Gold Blend from one of his elegant coffee cups, made from pale stoneware decorated with thin lines of darker clay, an example of which was acquired by the Victoria and Albert Museum, and I think they're still popular today. But it was living national treasure Matsui Kosei who raised nerikomi to the status of an important new medium for the serious studio artist, taking his inspiration from early Chinese examples and developing the technique through research and experimentation into colored glazes and clays. In contrast to Matsui, from the moment Kondō Takahiro started to use nerikomi, his ambitions for the technique went much further than the creation of aesthetically pleasing surface effects. We'll come on to this slide in a second, but just speaking about Kondo and nerikomi for a moment, his explorations of the technique are another aspect of a career marked by determination to seize every opportunity for growth, to become a ceramic artist rather than an artisan, and to make work that expresses a personal vision. His first experiments with clay as a pictorial material date back 3 decades to the early 1990s, just after that trip to Sao Paulo, when he was back in Kyoto pursuing radical experiments, including a kind of painting in clay applied to paper, punningly called doro ingu, using the Japanese word doro, mud. The doro ingu phase was short-lived, but the idea of pictorial clay stayed with Takahiro until he employed nerikomi, as we've already seen, in a series of tea bowls made in the immediate aftermath of the Great East Japan earthquake and tsunami of March 2011. That disaster set Takahiro wondering about the relationship between the human race and the natural world, and in particular about his own practice as a ceramic artist, whose work involves the interplay of the same elements of water, earth, fire, and air that could combine with man-made nuclear reactors to produce such devastating results. It's easy, of course, and we've had an opportunity in looking at one of the slides, earlier slides, to make a visual analogy between the swirling, unpredictable surface patterns of the tea bowls and the appearance of the seawater that swept capriciously over the Japanese coast on that terrible day, carrying everything in its wake, as we saw on our television screens all around the world. But Takahiro's use of nerikomi has another significance as a technique in which chance effects are allowed a greater role, and the maker never aspires to absolute control over the appearance of the finished object. The 2011 bowls also inevitably call to mind the prominent role of chaotic raging water in Japanese pictorial art, as celebrated, of course, in Hokusai's Great Wave, but we know that too well for me to show it to you now, but also in folding screens by members of the stylistic movement we call Rimpa, including Ogata Korin, whose work you see here. Takahiro's own conception of nerikomi as a means of pictorial expression was evidenced in the title of his 2016 exhibition at the Joan B Mirviss Gallery, Waves of Ink, Painting in Porcelain. But technical breakthroughs over the intervening years now empower him to achieve still more painterly effects. In particular, by adding an exceptionally pure white clay to his palette, he now achieves a wider and more sharply defined range of expressive tonal contrasts, with results that, to my eye, come still closer to his declared goal of creating the ceramic equivalent of suibokuga, the atmospheric brush and ink landscape painting of medieval Japan. But also, of course, the same effect is seen in the Chinese paintings currently on display in the gallery. This last grand synthesis of nerikomi and ginteki, two almost alchemical processes that both conjure water out of fire, leaves us eager, or leaves me eager anyway, and I hope the rest of you, to discover where his bold experimental spirit is going to lead him next. Thank you.
Your comments are perfect to lead into the next question for Kondō Takahiro himself. So having seen these images from Joe in the prior slides, can you tell us about your relationship to painting? These wave sculptures utilizing marbleized nerikomi clay look so much like the flowing brushwork that you have called them, as Joe said, porcelain ink paintings. Why did you want to create this effect with clay, and what did you hope to achieve by doing so? Where do you find the similarities between the traditions of clay and ink painting that interest you personally as an artist? Kondo-san?
はい、染め付けの仕事からスタートした私にとって、描くということとフォルムとの関係性は重要なポイントです。陶磁器の器や形は単なるキャンバスではなく、絵とフォルムが調和することが大切であると、富本健吉、祖父近藤雄三、父博、あるいは鴨田長治の作品から学んだことです。
As someone who started his career working with sometsuke, cobalt blue underglaze porcelain, the relationship between the drawing or design and the shape of object has been a very important point. A porcelain vessel or form is not just a simple canvas. There needs to be harmony between the shape and the design. It's something that I learned from Tomimoto Kenkichi, my grandfather Yuzo, my father Hiroshi, and from the works of Kamota Shoji.
1990年代初め、私は自らの新たな染め付けを構築するために多くの実験的なドローイングを紙の上やキャンバスの上に描くことを始めました。そしてまたパネルの上に土で描いたドローイング、ドロー ING という作品も制作してきました。
In the early 90s, I wanted to create my own version of sometsuke. So I started making all sorts of experimental drawing on paper and on canvas. And I used clay to draw on panels and call them draw ing, drawing, which is a pun on English word drawing, using a Japanese term draw, which stands for mud or clay.
その後、1994年、時空湖シリーズタイム&スペース という幾何学抽象的な染め付けを成立することができました。
This led to Time and Space series in 1994, where I incorporated abstract geometric designs into 染め付け。
今回の新作のウェーブも確かに水墨という絵画的なイメージを連想されることでしょう。重要なことは陶芸でしか成し得ない表現であるということです。
I can imagine many are reminded of ink painting when they see my new wave works. But what's important to recognize is that it is only by mixing and marbleizing different kinds of clay that this kind of expression or patterns is possible. There is no other way around it.
ウェーブは私の火から生まれる水というコンセプトのある意味集大成的な作品であると思っています。ウェーブは3つの磁気土、白、黒、グレーを練り込むことで生まれる水のさまざまな流動、波、滝、あるいは渦、流れなどと私の銀滴彩のミストや雫に見えるリアルな表現と相まって有限の世界が出現します。
I see this wave series as the pinnacle of my long-standing artistic exploration of the concept water born of fire. I take 3 different colors of porcelain clay, black, white, and gray, and knead them together in nerikomi fashion. And somehow all different patterns of water emerge. It's waves, waterfalls, whirlpools, and streams. And then there's my gintekisai silver mist surface, which looks just like very realistic mist or water drops. And when I combine these 2 types of expression, the mysterious world of Yugen emerges.
そのイメージは伝統的な水墨の世界の精神性とつながっていることでしょう。また、自然性ということで共通項が見出せます。
I suppose you could say that these images of water resonate with the spirituality expressed in traditional ink painting. And also there is a shared sense of nature in both my work and that of ink painting.
私の考える自然性とは、人間が介在することによって自然がより生き生きするということ。言い換えれば、人間の意志と意図と自然の力や偶然性が融合することで生まれる美しさや魅力のことです。
I think I need to explain what I mean by the sense of nature. To me, true nature is not when it's completely free from human intervention. The interaction between human beings and nature is inevitable as well as necessary in order for the true pure nature to manifest, which is the beauty beyond our creative intention. It happens when human intention and determination are met with the unpredictable force of nature. That's when nature becomes even more nature-like, more animated and lively with a human touch.
まさに陶磁器の身体的制作プロセスや水墨絵画が生まれる技法はこの自然性に根ざしているのではないでしょうか。
And that is precisely what I see in both the physical process of making porcelain and the technique of ink painting. I feel they both are rooted in the same quality of nature.
私のウェーブは波であり雫です。波動でもあります。そして瞬間的、永遠的な移ろいという時間を内包しているのです。
My wave works evoke the movement of waves, the spray of water that they throw off, and the power of surging waves that ripples out. They capture the time of transience of both impermanent and eternal nature. Thank you.
ありがとうございます。
Thank you both. For those who can't see these pieces in person, you are missing a lot by looking at these images on the screen. When you're confronted with them face to face, the power and the dynamism and the richness of these surging dangerous waves is palpable. And I think very moving to the audience as they encounter them. And thank you, Kondo-san, for giving us a very clear picture of your inspiration as Mother Nature has brought you to this artistic level. Thank you. My last individual question, the final question will be more of a group question, is to Glenn. So welcome back. How would you place Kondō Takahiro's singular sculptures in the context of international contemporary art? Are there artworks of modern and contemporary art that resonate with Kondo's works in terms of form, perhaps material, and or themes? And how does Kondō pull away and different from these precedents and peers in intriguing new ways? Glenn?
Yes, thank you. So this topic is going to bring us from one extreme of Kondo's practice to another. So away from that very suggestive language of waveforms, which could be understood either as landscape or as abstraction, to his engagement with figuration. So as we've seen, one of his most significant bodies of work is the Reduction series, where he effectively creates a kind of self-portraiture while also referring to the history of figurative art in East Asia. And I think a very funny, but also provocative comparison can be made to this wonderful work by Namjoon Paik, which is one of a series of Buddhas that he created in the 1970s, always staging a kind of relationship between a Buddhist sculpture and a piece of contemporary technology. So you might say a kind of encounter between past and present, but also a very wry meditation on a meditation itself, a kind of inquiry into what it might be to look at the self. And of course, one of the wonderfully amusing things about this is that these are inert objects. You know, it's a piece of cast bronze and a piece of electronics that are locked into this relationship with one another through the linking mechanism of the camera and the closed circuit video, so that you have all of these non-human things creating an image of introspection. And of course, what Kondo is doing is not funny. I think we should be quite clear about that. And one reason that I introduced this work by way of contrast is to highlight, in fact, the seriousness and if you like, the gravity of what Kondo is doing in this quasi-religious self-portraiture. But I think it's also very interesting that he is at least implicitly placing himself within a tradition of Buddhist statuary, by, if only by implication or allusion, in a way that adds him to a kind of canon of sort of referential treatments of the theme that Namjoon Paik is also a part of. Now, if we go to the next slide, very different artist and very different artwork, but one that again is very similar to Kondo's work in one respect, which is to say that both Janine Antoni's Lick and Lather and Kondo's Reduction series involve the process of life casting. So in the case of Kondo's work, obviously what we have is clay cast from life and then fired so that the clay shrinks, as we've heard. In the case of Janine Antoni's work, what she did was to cast herself in chocolate and in soap, and then she actually did lick the chocolate one and then took the soap one with her into a bathtub, and if you like, eroded the surfaces of those two self-portrait busts. So in both cases we have a kind of subtractive process that the work is being subjected to. And this comparison to me exposes an aspect of Kondo's work that we might not otherwise notice, which is that it could also be seen as an artwork about masculinity. This is clearly a work about femininity, you know, the idea of self-care that's implied by the soap Janine Antoni, or the attraction or desire to chocolate that's in the other half of the work. These play on stereotypes about women in our culture. And I think there's something quite haunting in the idea that Kondo's Reduction series is at least potentially a kind of evocation of fragility and a way of thinking about the male body and his own body as the artist as something that does in fact shrink over time, makes you also think about aging, and also makes you think about disappearance, and maybe even transcendence, which connects it to the question of Buddhism as a possible context for seeing that work. And then one last example, if we go to the next slide, of this kind of casting and self-portraiture is the British artist Mark Quinn's series of works, which are entitled simply Self. Quinn actually makes one of these every 5 years. So it's a kind of clock-like regulation of his own lifespan, his own experience. And what he does is to cast himself life-size in blood, which sounds impossible and certainly surprising. But by using freezing technology, he is actually able to create a full-size rendition of his own head in blood, and it's shown in a gallery in a refrigerated display case. And I think, again, here, mostly what we're looking at is a case of contrast. So if we think of Kondo's work as playing on a Buddhist tradition, certainly if we think of blood as a very highly charged material in the history of Christianity, we could understand this as a kind of Western or European postmodern form of portraiture that relates to that religious tradition. But also, I think it's important to see Kondo's work as also having a kind of reassurance, which is opposed to the kind of shock and, in a way, the gratuitous, almost grotesque quality of this object, which, after all, did Quinn emerged at the same time as Damien Hirst, another notorious British artist of that period in the 1990s. And there is a kind of aggression or kind of shock value to this work, whereas Kondo's work in general, not only his figural sculptures, to me implies a kind of serenity and a sense of persistent connection that this work, I think, very much wants to deny or contradict. So another important contrast there. And I think, although we can see a lot of material connections here between Kondo's reduction work and these various forms of figural sculpture, often what we're looking at is through the juxtaposition is a way of understanding what really makes Kondo's work so unique. One more slide to look at, just to say that I think also it would be worth thinking, apart from the narrow question of figuration, about Kondo's attitude to materiality, which I already did touch on earlier with respect to the Ginteki glaze and the idea of a kind of hyperrealism. But I think it's very interesting to, again, juxtapose Kondo's work to the big clay series that Urs Fischer is so well known for. And for those who haven't encountered this body of work before, it's very interesting, I think, for a ceramic crowd. What Fischer did was simply to take a few lumps of clay and squeeze them in his hand, and then scan them digitally, and then have that little amorphous shape recreated at absolutely massive scale, as you can see here, the size of this, filling an entire Italian piazza. One of the amazing things about this is that his own fingerprints are replicated, 7 or 8 feet in length, and of course in permanent aluminum rather than the original clay of the model. And so here what you have is, again, quite a funny and maybe self-satirical statement about the artist's own gesture and its value. So the idea that the merest the merest act of holding a bit of clay in the hand could be worth this kind of extremely expensive and monumental forceful reimagination. Also, perhaps it's a little bit of a satire of the history of abstract expressionism. So you might think of it in relation to Willem de Kooning sculptures, for example. But leaving all that aside, what I think this comparison really forces our attention to is the care that Kondo does bring to ceramics as a one-to-one medium, as an analog medium. Hasn't obviously passed through this process of digital replication, hasn't been rendered gargantuan and spectacular in the way that so much contemporary art is today. So I think that in a way that's consistent with his approach to figuration, there's also, for all of the indeed spectacular qualities of his work, there is also a kind of underlying humility or modesty and a kind of continuing connection to the earth that I would see as connected actually to many of the other aspects of the Japanese tradition that we care about so much, that do go back centuries through the history of tea ceremony and so on, and that haven't newly arrived into the field in the past 20 or 30 years. So in sum, I think what we have in Kondō is a really compelling combination of engagement with contemporary media culture, contemporary fine art practice, all the possibilities of conceptualism that implies, but also a retention of those more core values that draw us back to this medium again and again. And I would say that thinking not just about Japanese ceramics, but ceramics internationally, he is really a unique figure in being able to bring those two seemingly opposing approaches to the medium of clay into a dialectical relationship in that way.
Thank you, Glenn. That was really quite brilliant and an amazing contrast looking at the Borgello here. And I'm, Michelangelo over there and probably Donatello over there, and this amazing structure. And then putting it in the context of the Far East. And I would argue Kondo's more meditative approach towards sculpture and its purpose serving a different function than what these men have done. It would have been interesting to put up one of Kondo's heads in juxtaposition to the one cast in blood, where for Kondo, surface and beauty is an important integral part of his oeuvre, versus someone it's a little bit more shock and awe approach, but you still have two heads of two men looking at self-reflection. Thank you. My last question is to Carol and Joe, because everyone is probably dying to hear what we've been alluding to for the last hour, which is the upcoming shows and publications. So Carol and Joe, first Carol, many devoted collectors and curators have supported Kondō Takahiro's artistry over the years, but I think many new audiences will discover his incredible art in an exhibition that is set to tour museums across the United States starting next year, which you have organized. You have not just organized it, you are the cheerleader and spearhead making this all happen. Could you tell us about this major Kondo family exhibition and how you managed to put the program together and how you got so many museums on board? And from Joe, who's been in charge of the accompanying publication, can you tell us more about that and the other publication that you showed the images of the startling cover a few questions ago? Carol, I guess you first, please.
I guess it goes back to the original question, the why and the how, isn't it? It's just, you just look. So when I actually started approaching some of the museums that I know, it was similar to having a sit-down dinner for 6 and having 20 people and asking 20, and when you're gauging interest and they all say yes. The museums are, it was extremely easy to get this on calendars. Everybody wanted it. I actually triple booked it a couple times by mistake. I wasn't that organized. I'll quickly go through the list of the museums that are signed up. Beyond the 6 that have signed up, it's impossible to predict it out that far in the late 2020s, early 2030s. And then if Joe can talk about some more of it in detail, and I'm happy to answer questions, but the exhibition will open featuring the Kondo family pieces, approximately 56 pieces. It'll open at the University of Miami, the Lowe Art Museum, and actually March of 2023. Then after that, it'll go to the Brooklyn Museum for most of 2024. After Brooklyn, it'll go to the Minneapolis Institute of Art from February 2025 to September of 2025. After Minneapolis, it'll go to the Crocker Art Museum, Sacramento, October of 2025, and these are approximate dates from now on, but the order should remain the same. So the Crocker should have it toward the end of 2025 to about mid 2026. After the Crocker, It'll go to the Crow Collection of Asian Art at the University of Texas, Dallas, 2026 through early 2027. After that, to the Ackland Art Museum at the University of North Carolina for most of 2027. After that, I've got about 6 to 10 more museums that want it, but I'm not yet ready to put it in order, and I probably can't name them all.
Thanks, Carol. Joe, can you tell us a little bit about the publication that's going to accompany this monumental tour?
Sure. I mean, this project is going to keep me occupied, I think, probably into my 80th year, the way it's going. This is, as you just heard, it's an exhibition of 56, 57 works or so. About 20 of them are by Kondo's father, grandfather, and Uncle Yutaka, as you can see from the illustration on the back of the catalog cover here. And it'll take us through the history of first of all, the history of the work done by his predecessors, the white bowls, the blue and white ceramics, the work of Kondō Yutaka, and then there will be a sort of grand tour through all of Kondō Takahiro's right from the earliest blue and white pieces right through to the exploded, collapsed white porcelain vase that you see on the cover. And we have a great lineup of authors for this, as well as Glenn Adamson, who you've heard from today. We'll have Dr. Rachel Gottlieb, formerly at the Gardner in Canada and now at the Crocker Art Museum. And there was also a very important and useful essay by Matthew Welsh of the Minneapolis Institute of Art, one of the participating venues, which will go in some detail into the role of Kondō Takahiro's reduction pieces, and in particular the way that they were handled at the Minneapolis Museum of Art. I think I've covered all the authors. Yes, that's correct. And here's the book. It's going to take final shape tomorrow, we hope, at a meeting that's to be held with the designer. And I hope that we will have this on the market for you to enjoy in March, exactly a year from now. Thank you.
Thank you, Joe. I can't wait, and I look forward to being a United Frequent Flyer participant going from venue to venue, seeing the installation, because I'm sure it will look very different at each venue that it arrives at. And I also know that many of the participating museums already have Kondō family material in their collection that they're hoping to augment to these venues, making each show different from the show before and the show after. So it's going to necessitate all of Kondō Takahiro's fans to be traveling across this country for many years to come. And hopefully, Joe, we'll all make it to our 80s. We're all getting there. Bonnie, let's look at the next slide. I just wanted to give you the cover of the book that Joe also was the editor for, which has essays by a team of scholars that he's already told you about. This book will be available at the end of the month, or orders will be able to, I don't know if they'll arrive on my doorstep that soon, but we will try and make them available to anyone who wishes a copy. It's a huge book, so it's costly, but it's glorious. It's a work of art in and of itself. The next slide, Bonnie. Another book that's just coming out that will be available later this spring is the remarkably personable recollections of Allison Halsey North and Louise Court, who traveled, of course, a period of almost 20 years interviewing a group of Japanese clay artists, Kondō Takahiro being one of the 16. And it recounts their conversations with these individuals, which shed tremendous insight and light into what being an artist at that point in time from that particular family or from that particular region. It will become an indispensable key to seeing Japanese clay art from the perspective of the artist. And it's beautifully illustrated and really wonderfully put together as only Louise could coordinate. And lastly, the book that has been on the market for the show that is currently at the Minneapolis Institute of Art on Kamoto Shoji, It's a gorgeous book. Minneapolis has done a fantastic job, and you can order that book directly from their bookshop. So that's what I wanted to say. I know we have a couple questions, and I know we're running long, but I really would like to ask Kondo this rather interesting question that has come in, if I may. Kondo, your latest wave series that we have in our gallery includes some of your most daring forms that you have ever attempted structurally and technically. They are created by combining your signature gintekisai silver mist with the challenging technique of marbleization, nerikomi. Can you please tell us a little bit about how you created the largest monolith? The one, someone else asked a question, how big are these things? Well, the largest monolith we have is over 5 feet in height. So how did you manage to accomplish this? And what were some of the challenges you sort of faced in doing so?
少し技術的なことになるかもしれませんけど、ジョー・アールさんも歴史的に練り込みの技法のことをご紹介いただきましたけれど、私の場合は磁器の土、ポースレンという土を使っていて、でやはりそれが、3つの、今日も説明しましたが、3つのタイプの黒白グレーを混ぜ合わせるということで、非常になんていうんですかね、私も30年近くもちろん土を中心に仕事をしてきてますが、非常にそのリスクの高いテクニックなんですね。土が混ぜ合わせられることによって、非常にある意味で割れやすい。そういう意味で大きくなればなるほど、割れてしまうという、そういう意味で今回大きな作品が作ることは非常に難しいテクニックではあります。はい。
So I'm going to talk about the technical side as Joe explained, historical side of nerikomi. Let me just tell firsthand that nerikomi with porcelain is very technically demanding, especially when it comes to marbleizing 3 colors, black and white and gray colors of porcelain clay. It is very difficult. It's very, I would say it's risky and even to make it, the bigger the size is, the bigger the risk is, because it's easier to deformation and the cracks. It's easy to crack, especially with porcelain clay. So I've been in this field. I have this experience with clay for over 30 years. But even for me, this is very technically demanding to handle. Thank you. 先生、もし他にありましたらどうぞ。
そのようなことです。はい。以上です。はい。
That's it. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Takahiro-san. There was one other question, maybe this would be a good one for Joe, that is there the marbleization technique, you've talked about marbleization in other works, how would you, especially in the context of blue and white, the context of blue and white and marbleization, and with the marbleization that Takahiro is doing and using cobalt for that, how would you say that he is an artist working in Kyoto and having a grandfather who's a Ningen Kokuho living national treasure for that Sometsuke tradition? How do you feel that Takahiro has broken away from that in new ways? But still keeps a foothold in that delicate balance between tradition and modernity or contemporary aesthetics?
Well, that's a very big question, isn't it?
Yeah, well.
And I suppose you want a very big answer, but
No, a brief answer because we're running late.
Because
yes,
we are running
10
late.
words or less. Okay.
I think I would say the most essential thing, let me give you a little quick anecdote. I once went to the Tomimoto Kenkichi Museum, which is in or near Nara, And all I knew at that time was about his elaborate, highly enameled and gilded work. And the thing that immediately caught my eye actually was those beautifully turned white pots. And I think if anything, it's that throwing tradition that runs right through all three members of the family and Uncle Yutaka and Tomimoto himself. And as we've seen, it's something that Kondō Sensei has just recently come back to with his large white collapsed jars. So clay, throwing, the wheel, that's still fundamental, even though he's departed from that so frequently along the way.
Of course, the perfect answer. Thank you, Joe. One final question from the audience is for Kondō Takahiro-san. And the audience is wondering about the calligraphy on the screen behind you and whose calligraphy that might be and what is its significance? Why is it there? Can you answer? I know it's a family heirloom.
この書はですね、清水寺の、前館長の大西良慶さんという、方の、書です。というのは私の、5代前の高祖父は清水寺の寺侍をしていました。ですから近藤家と清水寺というのはすごく深いご縁がありまして、その方から、が書かれた書を金の屏風に私の祖父が貼ったものです。
So it is a calligraphy done by the previous abbot of Kiyomizu Zen temple called Onishi Ryokei. Just because my great-grandfather used to be a protecting god for the temple, so my family has a strong relationship with the Kiyomizu temple. That's why we took this calligraphy and framed it with gold.
いいですか?
Perfect. Thank you. Thank you. Beautiful calligraphy. And the Kiyomizu temple has a long history with your family that you can read about in many publications of going back to his great-great-grandfather. So it's wonderful that we have tonight tied tradition to Kondo's ancestral roots, his location in Kyoto. And with that, I thank all my speakers for giving such brilliant answers to these questions and giving further insight into the oeuvre of Kondō Takahiro. And thank you all for staying tuned for so long. It's been a joy. And all I can do is whoever's out there, wherever you live, there's Kondō works in museums across the world. Try and get to your local museum and see if you can experience some of his work in person. Or if you're in New York, come and visit our exhibition or follow Carol Horvitz trail across the United States as she proliferates with her exhibitions from East Coast to West Coast, North to South. It's an exciting prospect. And definitely add one of these amazing volumes to your library. If you can't afford a work, you should afford the books, and the books will inspire you. Thank you very much, and good night, everyone.